Kellen Parker had written 43 letters before she said yes. He read her last reply so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. I am 18, healthy, and willing to make a good life. That was all. 8 words he had built a future around. Then the train stopped. The crowd parted, and he saw her, small as a girl, gripping a carpet bag with both hands, eyes scanning the platform, like she was expecting someone to tell her this was a mistake. Kellen's stomach dropped straight through the ground. She's just a child. If this story touches something in you, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Pahrump station wasn't much. A plank platform, a water tower that leaked at the seam, and a depot agent named Stu Briggs, who smelled like pipe tobacco and old coffee. On any other Tuesday, Kellen would have walked straight through without stopping. But today he'd put on his good shirt, the dark one ironed twice. He'd even trimmed his beard that morning, which he hadn't done since his mother passed 3 years back. He'd stood in front of the cracked mirror in his bedroom and told himself he was being practical. A ranch needed 2 people. He was 24, the land was producing, and he was tired of eating alone. That's what he'd told himself. He hadn't told himself he was nervous. But his hands gave him away. He'd already folded and unfolded his hat brim 4 times since parking the wagon. The train from the east came in 20 minutes late. The engine breathed out a long hiss of steam, and the platform filled fast with bodies traveling merchants. A family with 3 loud boys, a preacher with a black case, 2 miners still wearing their work dust. Kellen stood back and let them pass, scanning every face, looking for a woman who matched the photograph. The photograph was tucked in his breast pocket. He'd looked at it so many times he could have drawn it from memory. A young woman, dark dress hair pinned up a cautious half-smile that could have meant anything. The photographer's name was stamped on the back, Voss & Sons, Fulton, Missouri. He'd written to the agency in February. They'd sent back a match by April. Her name was Helena Voss. Her father had recently died. She had no brothers. Her mother had remarried a man she described only as unsuitable, a word that had stayed with Kellen because of how carefully it had been chosen. She listed her age as 18. He was watching the platform clear when he saw her. She came off last, stepping down carefully, like she was testing whether the ground would hold. The carpet bag was enormous for her frame, a deep brown traveling case, with brass buckles that she gripped with both hands pressed together like she was carrying something she couldn't afford to drop. Her coat was too heavy for Nevada heat, a wool thing with a fraying left cuff. Her hair, a warm honey color, was pinned but coming loose on one side, strands catching in the dry wind. And her face, she couldn't be older than 16. Kellen didn't move for a full 5 seconds. No, that isn't right. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and looked at it again, then back at her. The half-smile wasn't there now. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes were moving fast, searching the platform with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the world didn't announce its intentions in advance. Green eyes wide-set, darker at the edges. She looked like someone who'd had to be her own protection for a long time and was very, very tired of it. She saw him before he could decide what to do. He was the only man standing still on the platform. He realized that too late. She walked straight toward him, chin up, like she'd practiced the walk in a mirror, and she was going to do it correctly, even if it killed her. "Mr. Parker," she said. Not a question. A statement said like she was closing a door behind her. "Miss Voss." His voice came out steadier than he felt. He extended his hand and she shook it, her grip firm, deliberate, lasting exactly 2 seconds before she let go. There was a pause that lasted too long. "You look younger than your photograph," he said. The words came out before he could stop them. He watched her face tighten at the center, not hurt, not angry, something more guarded than either of those, like she'd been waiting for that sentence. "I'm 18, she said. "I have my papers if you need them." "I don't need them." "Then why did you say it?" He didn't have an answer for that. He picked up her bag before she could protest. She tried reaching for the handle half a second too late and led her toward the wagon. He could feel her walking 2 steps behind him, maintaining a specific distance, And he understood the way you understand something without wanting to, that she had learned to measure the distance between herself and people she didn't trust yet. He'd written her 43 letters. She didn't trust him yet. That was completely fair. Shag. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. The road was hard-packed dirt that rattled the wagon wheels and threw up pale dust that coated everything. Helena sat on the bench beside him with her bag held upright between her feet, hands folded in her lap. She looked at the desert like she was studying it for a test. "It's different than Missouri," she said after about 10 minutes of silence. "I imagine so. Flat and dry. Mostly." Another silence. The horse, a brown gelding named Chester, who Kellen had owned for 6 years and trusted completely, tossed his head at a jackrabbit that crossed the road, and Helena's hands tightened on each other, but she didn't make a sound. "Have you been to Nevada before?" Kellen asked. "I've never been west of the Mississippi." "What made you willing to come this far?" She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Her gaze was very steady for someone so young. "The same thing that makes anyone leave where they are," she said. "The place stopped being safe." He didn't ask what she meant. He understood she was telling him exactly as much as she'd decided to tell him, and asking for more would cost something he hadn't earned yet. "The ranch is about 600 acres, he said instead. "I run cattle, some horses. Small operation, but it produces. The house is modest, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a covered porch. I built it myself 4 years ago." "You live alone?" "Have for 3 years. Since your mother passed," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I mentioned that in a letter." "You mentioned it twice," she said. "March and May. The second time you described her as the most stubborn woman you'd ever known, and then you apologized for saying it that way." She paused. "You didn't have to apologize. It sounded like respect." Kellen looked back at the road. He'd written 43 letters, and apparently she'd read every one of them with considerably more attention than he'd given to her responses. He felt something shift very slightly in the calculation he'd been making since the platform. "Miss Voss," he said, "I want to tell you something before we get to the house." She waited. "When I wrote to the agency, I was looking for a partner, someone to share the work and the life. I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't looking to purchase someone's compliance. I want you to understand that." She said nothing. "What I mean to say is—" He was fumbling now, and he knew it. "I looked at you on that platform, and I thought, that's a young woman who didn't come here because she wanted to. She came here because she had to. And I know what that feels like, making a choice, because the alternative is worse. And I don't want—" He stopped a third time. "I don't want our arrangement to start from that place." Helena was very quiet. Then she said, "What place would you prefer it to start from?" "From you being safe. From you having time to decide. From the marriage happening when you want it to happen, not when the arrangement requires it." He felt her looking at him. He kept his eyes on Chester's back. "That's an unusual position for a man who paid an agency fee," she said carefully. "I expect it is. Most men in your situation would want to move forward quickly, to secure the arrangement. I'm not most men." "No," she said quietly. "You're not." Chester turned the corner at the old juniper tree, and the ranch came into view. The main house, the barn, the fence lines running west into the heat haze. Kellen pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch steps and set the brake. "There's a second room," he said. "I put a new lock on the door last week. The key's on the inside." He climbed down and retrieved her bag. "The room is yours for as long as you're here, however long that is." Helena climbed down on her own side. She stood in the dust and looked at the house for a long moment, and something moved across her face. Something he couldn't name. A complicated feeling that looked like relief, mixed with grief. Like someone who'd been walking a very long time, and had finally been offered a place to sit. "Thank you, Mr. Parker," she said. "Kellen." "Kellen," she repeated like she was testing the shape of it. He carried her bag up the porch steps. She followed, and when he held the front door open, she walked through it and stood in the kitchen and looked around at the rough-hewn table and the iron stove and the single window with the cracked sill he kept meaning to fix, and she said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she set her hands on the table and looked at him. "I should tell you something too," she said. He waited. "I did read all your letters, carefully, twice most of them." She met his eyes steadily. "I chose to come here specifically because of how you wrote. Most of the men through the agency write about what they need. You wrote about what you had to offer. There's a difference." He didn't know what to say to that. "But I want you to understand something about me," she continued. "I'm not fragile. I survived 2 years in a house where I shouldn't have been, and I came 2,000 miles alone on a train to a desert I'd never seen to marry a man I'd never met. I'm not asking you to be gentle with me, because I'll break. I'm asking you—" She paused, choosing the words with precision. "I'm asking you to be patient with me, because I'm worth the patience. There's a difference there, too." The kitchen was very quiet. Kellen Parker, who had built a 600-acre ranch alone and weathered 3 bad winters, and buried his mother in hard ground without anyone to sit with him. After Kellen Parker felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that lived just below pride and just above relief. He felt like he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. "I think we understand each other, Miss Voss," he said. "Helena," she said, "if we're going to be living in the same house—" "Helena." She nodded once with the air of someone closing a negotiation. The first week was a precise and careful choreography of 2 people learning to occupy the same space without intruding on each other. Kellen rose before dawn as he always had, and had coffee going by the time Helena appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still loose, wrapping her coat around herself against the early desert cold that people from the east never expected. He'd set out a second cup the first morning without making a thing of it, and she'd picked it up without comment, and that had become the routine. 2 people, 2 cups, the fire in the iron stove crackling, the light coming up slow over the eastern hills. She didn't talk in the mornings, he noticed. She was present, but internal processing something working through the day ahead in her mind. He respected that. He'd spent 3 years in his own silence, and he knew the difference between solitude that was comfortable and solitude that was lonely, and hers didn't look lonely. It looked focused. He gave her the mornings. She found her own rhythm by afternoon. The cooking was the first trial. She'd said nothing to indicate she didn't know how to cook. She simply hadn't said she did, which in retrospect was a distinction he should have paid more attention to. The first morning she attempted biscuits and produced something that looked roughly right but had the structural integrity of Riverstone. Kellen ate 2 of them without changing his expression. Helena watched him chew. "You don't have to eat them," she said. "They're fine. They're terrible. I can tell by the way your jaw's working." He set one down. "They're a little dense." "I burned the bottom of the beans this morning too. I know how to cook simple things. My mother cooked, I watched, but we had a wood stove at home that ran completely differently from this one." She was looking at the iron stove like it had personally offended her. "I'll learn it." "I know you will. I'm not asking for reassurance," she said a little sharply. "I'm telling you the truth about where I am, so you're not pretending not to notice." He looked at her. "All right. The truth is the biscuits need more butter and less time, and the stove runs hot on the right side, so you want to keep things left of center. I'll show you." She moved to the stove immediately. Not waiting, not hesitating. She wanted to know how to do it correctly right now, and her focus when he demonstrated was absolute. She watched his hands, not his face, tracking the process like she was writing it into her memory permanently. By Thursday, the biscuits were edible. By Saturday, they were good. He'd expected to feel the awkwardness of proximity. 2 strangers sharing a house is never a simple thing. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the awkwardness gave way to something more like occupational efficiency. She saw what needed doing, and she did it. She didn't ask permission for things that didn't require permission. She moved through the house with a directness that suggested she was mapping it, understanding its logic, making it workable. But there were moments. He was in the barn mending a bridle when she came in without knocking. She didn't realize yet that the barn was his particular private space, the way her room was hers, and he looked up and she stopped in the doorway and said, "I'm sorry I didn't." And the way she pulled back very quickly, one hand going to the doorframe, told him something he hadn't wanted to know about what she'd learned to expect from men who were startled. "You're not interrupting," he said very evenly. "Come in." She came in slowly. "I found a harness hanging near the back of the house," she said. "I didn't know if it belonged somewhere or if I should leave it." "Bring it here. I'll hang it properly." She retrieved it, handed it to him, and stood watching him loop it over the post with practiced ease. Then she said without particular inflection, "My stepfather had a temper when he was surprised." Kellen kept his hands moving. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'm telling you because I know I pull back sometimes, and I don't want you to think it's about you." She was looking at the bridle. "It's just a reflex. It'll stop when I know better." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I won't take it personally." "Good." She turned to leave, then paused. "And for what it's worth, I've stopped pulling back in the kitchen." He looked at her. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face, quick and cautious, but real, and then she walked back toward the house. Kellen hung the harness and stood there in the barn for a moment, thinking that he had significantly underestimated this girl, and that the 43 letters, for all their sincerity, had done nothing to prepare him for her actual presence. It was on a Sunday, 12 days after her arrival, that he first understood how deep the water ran. He'd gone to town for supplies. He offered to take her. She declined, saying she wanted to spend the morning in the kitchen garden, and he'd left her there with a hoe and a pair of canvas gloves that were 2 sizes too large. When he came back 3 hours later, she wasn't in the garden. He found her on the covered porch, sitting on the plank floor, with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, holding a single folded letter. She was completely still, not crying, not reading, just sitting with it the way you sit with something you've carried a long distance and aren't ready to put down. He put the supplies in the kitchen and came back to the porch and sat down next to her on the floor without asking. Not close, a deliberate foot of space between them. He stretched his legs out and looked at the desert and said nothing. After a while she said, "It's from my mother." He waited. "She wrote it before I left. I couldn't read it on the train. I haven't been able to read it until today." She looked at the letter. "She says she's sorry for the choices she made, for letting things be what they were." A pause. "She says she hopes I find something better." Kellen was quiet. "The thing is," Helena said, "I don't know if she means it or if she's saying what she thinks a mother should say. And I can't tell anymore. I used to be able to tell." She turned the letter over in her hands. "I think I lost the ability to know whether someone means what they say." He thought about that carefully before he spoke. "How do you know about me?" he said. "Right now, do you think I mean what I say?" She looked at him, this direct green-eyed look that landed like a question. "Mostly," she said. "What would I have to do to get to entirely—" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Keep doing what you're doing. The gap closes on its own." He nodded. He looked back at the desert. "I never knew my father," he said. "He left when I was 4. My mother raised me alone on this land. She used to say that trust is like the water table, you can't see it, but you can feel when it drops." He paused. "She was right about most things. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was the most difficult woman I've ever known, and I've missed her every single day for 3 years." He said it plainly, without ornament. "You would have liked her. She didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone, and she could read a person in about 40 seconds flat." Helena laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, a short, surprised sound like it had escaped before she could decide whether to let it out. She looked startled by herself. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "Don't apologize for laughing," he said. "I said it to be funny." She looked at him again with that evaluating look. Then she set the letter down on her knee and looked out at the desert, and there was something different in her posture. Something had unlocked very slightly at the base of her spine. "Kellen," she said. Helena. I think... She stopped, started again. I think I made the right choice. Coming here. He didn't let himself make too much of that. He kept his expression easy and his voice level when he said, I think so too. But when he went inside to start supper, he stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked out at her still sitting on the porch. In the late afternoon light, the letter folded back in her hands, and he thought, be careful. Not with her. With himself. She was 18 years old, and she'd crossed 2,000 miles to survive, and she was worth every ounce of the patience he'd promised her. However long it took, he meant it. He was going to keep meaning it. That night after supper, which she'd cooked herself a plain but competent beef and potato stew, she stood at the sink, washing dishes, and said without turning around, Tell me about the ranch, not the practical things. Tell me what you love about it. Kellen set down his coffee cup. No one had ever asked him that. He thought about it for a genuine moment before he spoke. Early morning, he said. Before the sun clears the ridge, there's maybe 20 minutes where the light comes in sideways across the flats, and everything turns this particular color, not quite gold, not quite white, and it's completely still. No wind. The cattle are quiet. Chester's quiet. He paused. It's the only time I've ever felt like the world was exactly the size it was supposed to be. Helena had stopped washing the dish in her hand. She was listening with her whole body. I built this ranch to have something that was mine, he continued. Not inherited, not given. Mine because I made it. But that 20 minutes in the morning... He shook his head slightly. That part I didn't make. That part was here before me. I just showed up. She turned around and looked at him. I want to see it, she said. What? That light. Tomorrow morning. I want to see what you're describing. He looked at her standing there at the sink with soapy hands and a dish towel folded over her arm, and the certainty settled into him quietly but completely. This was not a transaction. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, it was not a transaction. I'll wake you before sunrise, he said. And he did. And she stood beside him on the porch in the cold morning air, coat wrapped tight, hands around her coffee cup, and watched that particular light come in across the desert flats, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, I see it. And Kellen Parker, who had waited 24 years to show that to someone, said nothing at all. The morning after she saw the light, Helena burned the oatmeal, not slightly. Thoroughly a black crust welded to the bottom of the pot that required soaking and scraping, and 20 minutes of work to salvage. She stood over the stove with a wooden spoon and a set jaw and didn't say a word about it. Just scraped and scraped until Kellen came in from the barn and looked at the pot and said, I'll take mine with coffee. And she laughed again, that same surprised sound. And this time she didn't apologize for it. That was how the second week began. Not with ceremony. With burned oatmeal and the slow, specific work of two people building a shared life from raw materials. She had questions, methodical, precise questions that she asked without embarrassment, which told him she'd spent time around people who made her feel foolish for not knowing things, and had decided somewhere along the way to refuse that feeling. She asked about the cattle, how many, what breed, what the seasonal rotation looked like. She asked about the water situation, the well depth, whether it had ever run low in drought years. She asked about the fence line on the west property. He'd mentioned a gap in a letter 6 months ago, and she wanted to know if he'd fixed it. He had in fact fixed it. The fact that she remembered it made him careful with his answers in a new way. You ask like you're planning to stay, he said one evening. She looked up from the socks she was darning. She'd found a basket of his unmended socks, stuffed behind the wood box, and had taken them on without being asked. I am planning to stay, she said. That was the arrangement. The arrangement was conditional. I told you that. You told me I could leave if I wanted. I don't want to. Why not? She set the sock down and looked at him with that direct green gaze. Because this place makes sense to me. The work makes sense. You make sense. She paused. That's more than I had in Missouri. He should have let it rest there. He said, what didn't make sense in Missouri? Her hands returned to the sock. My stepfather. His name was Gerald Marsh. He came to the house 8 months after my father died. My mother was frightened, I think. Frightened of debt, of being alone, of what would happen to us without a man's income. She spoke without particular emotion, the flat voice of someone who has processed a thing many times and is now just reporting it. He wasn't violent. I want to be accurate about that. He wasn't a violent man, but he had ideas about how a young woman should conduct herself, how much space she should take up, what she was and wasn't allowed to decide for herself. Kellen was very still. After 2 years of that, I was smaller than when he came, she said. Not in body, in... She searched for the word. In dimension. I had fewer dimensions than when I started. And you decided to stop getting smaller. I decided I'd rather risk the unknown than keep shrinking in a known place. She looked at him. The agency was the unknown. You were the unknown. She picked up the sock again. You've turned out to be a better unknown than I expected. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, I'm glad. Are you? She said it without challenge, genuine curiosity. I'm glad you're here, he said. I'm glad you told me. And I'm glad you came with the ability to say things plainly, because I don't have much patience for people who make me guess what they mean. She smiled, a real one this time, slower than the surprised laughs, something she'd chosen to let out, rather than something that had escaped. My father taught me that. He said unclear speech was the cause of half the world's suffering. Your father sounds like he was a reasonable man. He was the best person I've ever known, she said simply. And then he was gone, and everything after was trying to find something that felt half as solid. The fire crackled. Outside, the desert was going dark and cold. I think you might be close, Kellen said. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. 3 weeks in, she asked to help with the cattle. Not asked exactly, she appeared at the barn door at 5:40 in the morning. In her work clothes, the heavy coat, the canvas gloves, and said, "Tell me what to do." He told her. She was not naturally gifted with the cattle. They were large and unpredictable, and she was small and had no experience reading animal behavior, which meant the first morning ended with her being shouldered into the fence by a disgruntled heifer who had no interest in being moved. She hit the fence hard, a solid impact across her left shoulder that made Kellen move fast across the pen, and she stood up straight before he reached her, brushed the dust off her coat, and looked at the heifer with an expression that could only be described as professional displeasure. That was my fault, she said. I came in from the wrong side. It was, he agreed. You approached her blind spot. She didn't know you were there. Show me the right way. He showed her. She watched his approach, the angle, the steady pace, the way he kept one hand visible, the way he spoke low and constant, so the animal always knew where he was. Then she tried it herself, and the heifer moved without incident. Again, Helena said. So they did it again. By the end of the morning, she'd moved the small pen without being knocked down again, and she was sweating through her coat in the climbing desert heat. And when they walked back to the house, she was limping slightly from a boot that didn't fit quite right, and she didn't mention the shoulder once. You're going to be sore tomorrow, Kellen said. I'm sore now, she said. I'll be sore tomorrow regardless. What time do we start? He looked at her. Same time. Good. That was Helena Voss at 3 weeks. She had come to Nevada because she'd had to, but she was staying. He was beginning to understand on completely different terms. The town visit happened at the end of her first month because supplies were low, and he couldn't delay it anymore, and also because he thought she ought to know where she was geographically and socially. She'd be living here, and a town was its people as much as its buildings. Pahrump in 1878 was small enough that a new face registered immediately. Kellen had been expecting attention. He hadn't been expecting the specific quality of attention they received. Ruth Caldwell saw them first. Ruth ran the dry goods with her husband Frank and had an intelligence network that covered a 30-mile radius with impressive thoroughness. She came out from behind the counter when Kellen walked in with Helena at his shoulder and said, "Well, so this is the bride." This is Helena Voss, Kellen said. She's staying at the ranch. Ruth looked at Helena with the assessing directness of a woman who had earned the right to look at people directly. You're young, she said. I've been told, Helena said. How old? 18. Ruth looked at Kellen. He kept his face neutral. Ruth looked back at Helena. You from back east? Missouri. Family. My father is deceased. My mother remarried. And you came out here alone? Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment, conducting some internal calculation. Then she said with the decisive quality of a woman who made up her mind and stayed made up. Frank add a half-pound of cinnamon to the Parker order, the good kind. She looked at Helena. You bake? I'm learning, Helena said. Smart answer, Ruth said. Kellen, she's a smart one. I know, Kellen said. Helena looked at him briefly with an expression that was half surprise and half something more complicated. But not everyone in town received them that simply. At the hardware counter, a man named Dale Pruitt 40-something. Wide through the shoulders, a rancher from the north edge of the valley looked at Helena and then at Kellen with an expression that sat somewhere between curiosity and judgment. Young, ain't she? Pruitt said, loud enough that two other men at the counter heard it. Morning, Pruitt, Kellen said. I'm saying that's a young woman you got there, Parker. What is she, 16? 18, Helena said from directly beside Kellen. Pruitt looked at her like he was surprised she'd spoken. You talk for yourself, do you? When someone talks about me as though I'm not present, yes, she said. It seems like the appropriate response. The two men at the counter looked at each other. Pruitt's eyes went flat. Kellen said quietly and very clearly. We're done here, Pruitt, and put his hand under Helena's elbow, not gripping, just present a directional suggestion, and they walked to the other end of the counter. Helena said nothing until they were outside loading the wagon. Then she said, You didn't have to intervene. I didn't intervene. I extracted us before the situation got worse. I could have handled it. I know you could have. I wasn't protecting you from him. I was protecting him from you. He put a bag of flour in the back without looking at her. You were about to say something that would have followed us around this town for a year. A beat of silence. That's actually a fair point, she said. I have them occasionally. She climbed up onto the wagon bench. Kellen? He looked up. Thank you, she said. For earlier, with Mrs. Caldwell. You introduced me as a person, not a situation. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He climbed up and took the reins and said, That's what you are. She looked at him for a moment, then looked straight ahead as they drove out of town. The ride home was quiet, but differently quiet than the first ride, less like a gap between strangers, and more like the comfortable silence between two people who have already said the important things and don't need to fill the space. 38 days after her arrival, Helen awoke at 2 a.m. to a sound she didn't recognize. A low repetitive creak coming from somewhere outside, steady as a clock. She lay still for a moment listening, then pulled her coat over her nightgown and went to the window. The barn door was open, and light was coming through it. She went across the yard without taking time to think about whether she should. The night air hit like cold water. She pushed the barn door wider and found Kellen on his knees next to Chester. The lantern hung above his hands, moving over the horse's foreleg with deliberate focus. Chester was down on his side. That was wrong. Kellen's horse didn't lie down in Helena's observation unless something was wrong. What happened? She said. Kellen didn't look up. He was favoring the leg when I checked on him tonight. I think there's heat in the fetlock. His voice was controlled but taut. Could be the beginning of an infection. Could be he twisted it. She knelt down across from him. What do you need? There's a bottle of liniment on the workbench, the brown bottle, and the strips of clean cloth next to it. She retrieved them without being asked. Twice came back and handed them to him, and then held the lantern closer so he had better light to work with, and he glanced up once in a brief acknowledging way and then looked back at Chester's leg. He'll be all right, she said. I don't know yet. She held the lantern and didn't say anything else while he worked applying the liniment, wrapping the leg carefully, speaking low to the horse the whole time. The same low, constant tone he used when approaching the cattle, a sound that was more about steadiness than words. Chester's breathing evened out gradually under his hands. After a while, Kellen sat back on his heels and exhaled. "He'll rest it," he said. "I'll check it in the morning. If the heat's down, he'll be fine." Helena set the lantern down. She was kneeling in barn straw in her nightgown at 2 a.m, and she registered that fact only distantly as a footnote to the more immediate thing, which was that Kellen looked for the first time since she'd known him genuinely frightened. Not panicked, not unmanned by it, just briefly humanly frightened the way you are about the things you love and can't control. "He's been with you a long time," she said. 6 years. Kellen was still looking at Chester. "I bought him the summer I broke ground on the house. He's the first thing I bought when I had money to buy something I didn't strictly need. A horse you didn't strictly need." "I needed him," Kellen said. "Just not the way you need a work animal." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Complete sense," Helena said. "Sometimes the things that keep us going don't fit neatly in a ledger." He looked at her across the lantern light, this long, clear look, the kind that doesn't happen often between people, the kind that requires a specific quality of silence to be possible. "Helena," he said, "how did you end up on this side of the argument?" "What argument?" "You came here because you had to. That's what you said. But you don't act like someone who's making the best of a situation. You act like someone who's—" He stopped. "Building something." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "You come somewhere because you have to, and then you arrive and find it worth building, and after a while the reason you came doesn't matter as much as the reason you're staying." Chester shifted under Kellen's hand, and Kellen steadied him automatically, palm flat on the horse's neck, and Helena watched him do it, and thought about her father, who had been a man of exactly that quality, the instinct to steady without hesitation, without making a show of it. She hadn't expected to find that quality again. Not this soon. Not out here in the desert. "I'll stay with him a little longer," Kellen said. "You should sleep." "I'll stay with you," she said. He looked at her. "It's 2 a.m, he said. "You've got chores at sunup." "So do you." She pulled her coat tighter and sat back against the stall boards, knees drawn up, the lantern between them. "Besides, you talked to me on the porch when I needed it. This seems like the same thing." Kellen said nothing for a moment. Then he sat back against the opposite wall, and they stayed like that, two people on opposite sides of a lantern in the quiet barn. The horse between them breathing steadier, with every minute the desert cold held off by the warmth of close proximity and shared purpose. Helena said, after a long while, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." It was a strange request, and she knew it. But the middle of the night makes strange requests feel reasonable. Kellen thought about it seriously. "When I broke ground on this place," he said slowly, "I built the second room first. Before the kitchen. Before the main room. Before anything that I needed to live. I built a room for someone else first." A pause. "I don't know why I did it that way. It just seemed right. Like if I built the room, eventually someone would come." Helena looked at the lantern. "And then you placed an advertisement with an agency," she said. 8 years later," he said. "The room was there for 8 years before I did anything about it." She thought about that room. She'd been sleeping in it for 38 days. She'd put her mother's letter in the drawer of the small table beside the bed. She'd hung her 2 good dresses on the hooks by the door. "You built it for me," she said, not romantically as a fact, the way you state facts that are strange but true. "I built it for whoever came," he said. "You came." The lantern flame moved in a current of air, and the barn was very quiet. "Chester's going to be fine," Helena said, after a moment. "You can't know that." "I know," she said. "He has you looking after him." Kellen looked at her across the light, and this time neither of them looked away for a long while. When she finally went back to the house, the sky was beginning to lighten in the far east, that first faint change the world, adjusting before the sun, committed to anything. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at it and thought about a man who had built a room for someone before he knew who that someone was, and had waited 8 years and had kept his word from the first moment on the platform and had stayed in a cold barn through the night for a horse he loved. She went inside and did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table and watched the light come in through the window, and somewhere in that early morning silence, she understood, not with drama, not with declaration, but with the quiet certainty of something settling into its rightful place, that she was not making the best of a situation. She was exactly where she had been trying to get to. She just hadn't known what it looked like until now. Chester's leg healed clean. By the 4th morning, the heat was gone from the fetlock, and the horse was standing square and eating without complaint, and Helena came to the barn before breakfast, specifically to see it, and said, "I told you." And Kellen said, "You did." And that was the end of that. Except it wasn't because something had shifted in the barn that night, and they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it directly, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The days had a rhythm now. Not a forced one, a natural one. The kind that develops when two people stop negotiating every moment and start simply living inside the same hours. She was up before him most mornings now. Coffee already made when he came in from the first barn check, and she'd started leaving his cup on the left side of the stove because she'd noticed that was the side he reached for first. He'd started checking the kitchen garden fence when he did the property walk because the rabbits came from the east, and she hadn't figured that pattern out yet. Neither of them commented on these adjustments. They just happened, like water finding the path of least resistance. She had been on the ranch for 6 weeks when Ruth Caldwell came calling. Ruth arrived on a Wednesday in a wagon driven by her youngest son, carrying a covered dish, and the particular energy of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it. She came in without much ceremony, set the dish on the kitchen table, looked around the house with unabashed assessment, and then looked at Helena and said, "Well, you've done something with the place." Helena had in fact reorganized the kitchen substantially. Pots hung by size the dry goods in labeled tins she'd made from salvaged cans, the curtains washed and rehung, so they sat straight for the first time since Kellen's mother had put them up. She'd done it methodically over 3 days, not because anyone asked her to, but because disorder in a working kitchen cost time, and time on a ranch was not abstract. Kellen knew where everything was before, Helena said with a precision that acknowledged both the change and the original order. Kellen knew where one pot was, Ruth said, because it was the only one he used. She sat down without being asked and looked at Helena with that direct, calibrating look. "How are you getting on?" "Well," Helena said, "that's not an answer, that's a deflection. Try again." Helena looked at this woman, this frank, sharp-eyed woman, who had been the first person in Pahrump to treat her as a person rather than a novelty, and made a decision. "Better than I expected," she said. "Harder than I expected. Both things are true at the same time." Ruth nodded once satisfied. "That's an honest answer. What's hard? The distance." Helena sat down across from her. "Not between Kellen and me, the physical distance. I didn't understand what it would feel like to be this far from other people. In Missouri, you could walk to a neighbor in 10 minutes. Here, it's an hour by horse to the nearest woman I might talk to." She paused. "Some days that's fine. Some days it sits on me." "And Kellen. Kellen is," she chose the word carefully, "present. He's genuinely present, which I didn't expect from the arrangement. But there are things I can't say to him. Not yet." Ruth studied her. "Such as that some mornings I wake up and for about 30 seconds I don't know where I am. And the 30 seconds feels like falling." She said it plainly without self-pity. "And then I remember and it's all right. But the 30 seconds is there every morning." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered Helena's hand with hers. Briefly, firmly, the touch of a woman who didn't dispense comfort carelessly. "That stops," she said. "Give it time. There was a morning I woke up here and knew exactly where I was and realized I'd stopped waiting to be somewhere else. She pulled her hand back. You'll have that morning. Helena nodded. Now, Ruth said, uncovering the dish. A deep apple cake, the smell of cinnamon hitting the kitchen immediately. Tell me about the cattle operation. Frank says Kellen's been running short on hands. I want to understand what you're actually doing out here. So Helena told her. And in the telling, she realized she knew more than she'd thought she did. Kellen came in from the south pasture at noon to find Ruth Caldwell at his kitchen table, showing Helena the pattern for a winter coat. Both of them bent over a piece of paper, Helena asking questions in her methodical way, and Ruth answering with characteristic directness. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched this, and felt something he couldn't quite name, something uncomplicated and good, like watching a plant take root. He made himself scarce for the rest of Ruth's visit. Some conversations needed to happen without him in the room. Ruth left in the late afternoon, and Kellen found Helena on the porch afterward, sitting with the last of the apple cake on a plate, watching the light change over the flats. He sat beside her, and she handed him the fork without asking, and he took a piece and handed it back, and they ate the rest of it between them in the easy way of people who have stopped performing consideration and started just living it. She told me something, Helena said. Ruth tells everyone something. She told me that people in town are talking about our arrangement. Specifically, they're talking about the fact that we aren't married yet, 6 weeks in. Kellen had known this was coming. Small towns moved information like water through rock, slowly but completely. What are they saying? 2 camps, Helena said. One camp thinks there's something wrong with the arrangement and you're being foolish. The other camp thinks there's something wrong with the girl and she's being difficult. He looked at her. And what do you think about what they're saying? I think small towns survive on other people's business because their own business isn't interesting enough. She set the empty plate on the porch rail. But I also think... She stopped. Say it. I think the arrangement is becoming uncomfortable for you, she said. Not because of the town, because of... She gestured vaguely between them. Because of what this is now. It's not what we started with. He was very still. You told me you'd wait, she said. And you have. You've been extraordinary about it. But I watch you sometimes, and I think this man made me a promise that costs him something, and he keeps paying it, and he never complains about the price. She looked at him directly. And I want you to know that I see that. Helena, I'm not saying I'm ready, she said quickly. I'm saying I'm aware of what you're doing, of what it costs. She picked up the plate and stood. I wanted to say that. She went inside. Kellen sat on the porch in the failing light and thought about a woman who noticed everything and said the exact thing and never used words to soften a truth into something easier to swallow. He thought about how 18 was a number and not a condition, and how the number had stopped meaning much of anything to him 3 weeks ago. He thought about the promise he'd made, and whether the cost of it was showing on him, and whether she was right that it was. She was right. She was almost always right. He stayed on the porch until the stars came out. The fight, if you could call it that, happened on a Saturday. It started with a letter. Helena received it with the supply run, a sealed envelope from Missouri in handwriting she recognized, and went still over standing in the kitchen with it in both hands. Kellen saw her face when she read it. He was at the table cleaning a bridal fitting, and he looked up and watched the color leave her face in a controlled, deliberate way, like she was managing the departure. "What is it?" he said. "My mother." She set the letter on the table face down. "Her husband Gerald has put their house on the market. My father's house." Her voice was steady. "He's selling it. My father built that house. My mother grew up in that house. It belonged to my grandfather first. Can he do that? It's in his name now. He had her sign it over 2 years ago." She was looking at the letter, not at Kellen. "She says she told him about me, about this arrangement, about Nevada." A pause. "He told her she'd made a poor decision sending her daughter off to be a ranch hand." The last two words came out with a flatness that meant she was very angry. "He doesn't know what you are," Kellen said. "No," she said, "he doesn't." She picked up the letter and folded it precisely along its original creases. "He never did." She put the letter in her coat pocket and went outside, and Kellen let her have the hour she needed, and when she came back in, she was composed again, with the particular composure of someone who has decided not to spend their grief on someone who hasn't earned the witnessing of it. He should have left it there. Instead, when she sat down across from him that evening and picked up her mending, he said, "Helena, if it would help if you wanted to write to her, to your mother, to see about the house." "It wouldn't help," she said. "You don't know that." "I know my mother." She pulled a thread through and bit it off. She married him because she was frightened. She'll stay with him for the same reason. There's nothing I can say from 2,000 miles that will change that. Then write for yourself, not to change anything, just to... Kellen. She set the mending down. "I know you're trying to help. I understand that. But I don't need you to find me a solution to this. I need you to let me know it the way I know it." "I know," she said. "But stop." He stopped. The kitchen was tight with silence. After a moment, Helena said quietly, but very clearly, "I came here to build a new life, not to keep maintaining the old one from a distance. If I write to my mother every time I'm sad about what she's lost, I'll spend the next 30 years writing letters and feeling the same grief and never actually moving forward." She looked at him. "I understand that's not the comforting answer, but it's the true one." Kellen looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "That's it. All right. You told me to let you know it the way you know it. I'm letting you." She looked at him with something complicated in her face, surprise, and something underneath the surprise that looked almost like frustration, which confused him until she said, "Most men would argue. Most men haven't been paying attention to you for 6 weeks." Something moved across her face. She picked up the mending again. Her hands weren't entirely steady. "Kellen," she said. "Helena, I want to talk about the arrangement." She said it to the mending, not to him. "About where we are." He waited. "I came here in an arrangement that had specific terms," she said. "You offered me time. I've taken it. 6 weeks." She finally looked up. "I'm not the person who got off that train anymore. I know this place. I know the work. I know..." She stopped, started again. "I know you." "Yes," he said carefully. "I don't need more time to decide," she said. "I decided, Her jaw tightened. "I need you to know that I'm deciding not complying. There's a difference." "I know there is." "Do you..." For the first time her voice had an edge to it. Not anger exactly, something more raw. "Because sometimes I think you're still looking at me the way you looked at me on that platform. Like I'm young, like I'm fragile, like if you push too hard, something will break." "Helena, I have told you about Gerald Marsh. I have told you about my father. I have told you about the 30 seconds every morning when I don't know where I am. I have stayed up in a cold barn with you at 2 in the morning. I have learned your cattle and your horse and the way your stove runs hot on the right side." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "When do you start believing that I'm actually here, that I'm not going to shatter?" The kitchen was very quiet. Kellen set down what was in his hands. He leaned forward with his forearms on the table and looked at her. Really looked, without the protective caution he'd been maintaining since the platform, the deliberate gentleness he'd constructed like a fence around his own wants. "I believe you're here," he said. "I have believed it for weeks." "Then why are you still keeping me at arm's length?" "Because..." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "Because I built this whole arrangement around the idea that I would wait for you. That was the thing I promised. And I meant it. And I..." He looked at the table for a moment. "I'm afraid that if I stop waiting, you'll feel pushed. Even if you're the one who stopped it. Even if it was entirely your decision. I'm afraid you'll lie awake 6 months from now and wonder if you had enough time." The silence that followed was different from the others. Deeper, like the air before a storm changes quality. Helena set the mending down on the table. She looked at him for a long moment with those steady green eyes that missed nothing. "Kellen," she said, "I am telling you right now out loud with full knowledge of what I'm saying, I have enough time. I have had enough time." Her voice was quiet, but it filled the whole room. "The only thing I'm waiting for now is for you to believe me." He looked at her. He had been so careful, so disciplined. He'd built the patience like a structure plank by plank. And now she was standing on the other side of it and telling him it was finished, that the waiting itself had become the last obstacle, not the thing before it. "I believe you," he said. "Say it like you mean it." "Helena." He said her name like it was the whole sentence. "I believe you." She breathed out a long, slow breath like she'd been holding it for 6 weeks. "Good," she said. She picked up the mending again. He picked up the bridal fitting. The kitchen held them both in the ordinary way of a room where something extraordinary has just been decided, and the fire crackled low. And outside, the desert was enormous and still, and indifferent to the fact that two people had just found their way to the same side of a line they'd been standing on opposite sides of since a dusty train platform in September. After a while, Kellen said, "There's a preacher comes through Pahrump on the second Sunday of the month." Helena kept her eyes on the mending. "Is that right? Next second Sunday is 3 weeks out." "That seems like a reasonable amount of time," she said. He looked at her. The corner of her mouth was doing something careful and deliberate that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was clearly headed in that direction. "Helena Voss," he said. "Kellen Parker," she said back. And that said between two people in a quiet kitchen, with mending and bridal fittings, and the smell of coffee and the low sound of the fire, was more of a proposal than most people get. And it was exactly enough. The 3 weeks before the second Sunday of the month passed, the way significant time always passes too slowly when you were inside it, and too quickly when you looked back. Helena didn't announce the decision to anyone. Neither did Kellen. But in a town the size of Pahrump, the absence of an announcement was its own kind of information. And Ruth Caldwell appeared on the Thursday before the second Sunday with a length of ivory-colored fabric folded over her arm, and an expression that dared anyone to tell her she was presumptuous. "It's not a wedding dress," Ruth said, setting the fabric on the kitchen table. "It's good wool serge, practical, can be let out or taken in, will last 20 years if you treat it correctly." Helena looked at the fabric. She looked at Ruth. "How did you know?" she said. "I didn't," Ruth said. "I decided. There's a difference." She sat down. "Frank says I interfere. I say I act on available evidence. The evidence said you needed fabric and a friend in the room." She met Helena's eyes. "Am I wrong?" Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from Ruth and said, "No, you're not wrong." Ruth nodded once with the satisfaction of a woman whose instincts had been confirmed. "Good. Now, do you know how to use a sewing machine?" "My mother had a hand machine. I know the basic operation." Kellen's mother had a treadle singer in the back room. "He doesn't know I know that. I helped her move it in 18 years ago." Ruth stood up. "Show me." The singer was where Ruth had said it would be, in the back corner of the spare room, under a canvas cloth that had kept most of the dust off. Helena uncovered it and ran her hands over the cast iron frame, the familiar mechanism, and felt something turn over quietly in her chest. This woman she'd never met. This woman who had built the same ranch, who had been stubborn and capable, and had raised a son alone who turned out to be worth raising. "She'd have liked you," Ruth said from the doorway. Kellen said the same thing. Kellen's right more often than he knows. Ruth looked at the machine. "Can you make it work?" Helena sat down, threaded it from memory, and ran a test seam on a scrap of the canvas cloth. The tension was slightly off. She adjusted it, ran another, examined the result, adjusted once more. Ruth watched all of this without comment. "Yes," Helena said, "I can make it work." "Then I'll leave the fabric with you," Ruth said, "and I'll come back Saturday to check the fit." She was at the door when Helena said, "Ruth." Ruth looked back. "Thank you," Helena said. "Not for the fabric. For coming. For deciding I needed a friend in the room." Ruth's expression didn't soften exactly. It wasn't the soft type, but something in it opened briefly and genuinely. "Every woman needs someone who acts on evidence," she said. "I had one. Her name was Clara Parker." She nodded once. "Make the seams double-stitched. Nevada wind will test every thread you put in." She left, and Helena sat at the treadle machine in the quiet room, her hands on the fabric, and thought about Clara Parker, and the room she'd built this machine into, and the son she'd raised in this house, and the way the things we leave behind continue to hold people we never meet. She began to cut. Kellen knew something was happening in the back room, because Helena disappeared into it for 2 hours every afternoon, and emerged with thread on her hands and a particular focused expression he'd learned to recognize as her problem-solving face. He didn't ask. The asking would have cost something. He let it be the private thing it was. What he did instead was ride out to the south fence on the Wednesday before the ceremony and replace 7 posts that had been loose since spring. He rehung the barn door so it stopped sticking on the left side. He fixed the cracked windowsill he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. He did all of this with the specific energy of a man who has decided something and is expressing it through his hands because his mouth doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. On Friday evening, he rode into town and came back with a paper-wrapped package he carried directly to his room. Helena was on the porch when he passed, and she looked at the package and looked at him and said nothing, and he said nothing. And they were both aware that they were two people who had independently decided to prepare for something and were maintaining each other's privacy about it, which was its own form of intimacy, more intimate maybe than if they'd done it all together. That night at supper she said, "Are you nervous?" He considered the question honestly. "Not about the decision," he said. "About the mechanics, standing in front of someone saying words in a particular order. You don't like public ceremony. I built this ranch alone specifically so I could exist without performing for an audience." She smiled at that, the real smile, the full one she'd started allowing more frequently in recent weeks. "It'll be brief," she said. "I told Reverend Holt simple and short. He seemed relieved. I think he had a long afternoon scheduled." Kellen looked at her. "You already talked to him." "Tuesday," she said. "When I rode in for thread. You rode to town alone. Chester's leg is fully healed, and you were at the north fence. I know the road." She met his eyes with the steady directness he'd stopped being surprised by. "I'm capable of managing a 4-mile ride, Kellen." "I know you are." "Then why the face?" "I don't have a face." "You have a very specific face when you're recalibrating an assumption about me." Your left jaw tightens. He was genuinely startled. "My left jaw. You've had the face approximately 11 times since I arrived. I've been counting." She said it with complete composure, but her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was privately amused. "I consider it a measure of progress that the number is only 11. Kellen sat back in his chair and looked at this woman. This precise, observant, thoroughly awake woman who had arrived 2 months ago gripping a carpet bag and watching the world with the wariness of someone expecting it to be unreliable and thought that the left jaw comment was the most purely intimate thing anyone had ever said to him because it meant she had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her. 12, he said. "That face you just described counts as the 12th. She laughed full and unguarded, the kind she no longer tried to pull back, and the kitchen held the sound of it, the way a good room holds light. The second Sunday of the month arrived clear and cold, the sky that particular deep Nevada blue that appeared in late autumn and looked too saturated to be real. The ceremony was in the front room of the Pahrump Church, which held 20 people with comfort and 30 with determination. There were closer to 25, Ruth and Frank Caldwell, their 2 oldest boys. The depot agent Stu Briggs, who appeared to be there mostly out of curiosity. 4 neighboring ranch families who had made the ride in, and a scattering of town faces Helena recognized from the dry goods and the hardware counter. Dale Pruitt was not among them. She had noticed his absence and filed it away as information about the kind of man he was. Helena wore the wool serge dress she'd made at the Singer in Clara Parker's old room. It fit correctly. She'd gotten the shoulders exactly right on the third attempt, the seams double-stitched as Ruth had instructed. Ruth, seeing her before the ceremony, had looked at the work with the eye of an expert and said only, "Clara would have said you wasted thread on the underlining." Then after a pause, "Clara would have been wrong." Kellen was waiting at the front of the room in his dark shirt, the same one he'd worn to the train station, she realized, and the realization hit her somewhere under her sternum in a way she hadn't anticipated. He'd worn it to receive her, and he'd worn it to marry her, and whether that was intentional or just the only good shirt he owned, it meant something. He looked at her when she came through the door. She walked toward him without hurrying, and when she reached him and they stood together facing Reverend Holt, Kellen said very low, just for her, "You made that." "I did," she said. "It's the best thing in this room," he said. She kept her eyes on Reverend Holt and said nothing but her hand, which had come to rest in the crook of Kellen's arm, pressed slightly. The ceremony was, as requested, brief and simple. The Reverend asked the words, and they said the words, and Kellen Parker put a plain gold band on Helena Voss's finger. A band she hadn't known about until this moment. Which meant he'd kept a secret from her, which was remarkable, because she'd thought she knew all of his. And she looked at it on her hand and looked up at him, and he said quietly, "My mother's. I had it resized." She didn't trust her voice for a moment. Then she said, "It fits perfectly." "I measured your finger while you were asleep," he said, "with a piece of thread." "That's either very romantic or slightly alarming." "Both," he said. "Probably." Reverend Holt cleared his throat with the diplomatic patience of a man who had performed many ceremonies and understood that the real exchange always happened in the margins. "If you're ready," he said. They were ready. The reception, such as it was, happened in Ruth Caldwell's dry goods, which she had closed for the afternoon and decorated with impractical optimism, given the available materials. Pine boughs, some dried flowers, 2 good tablecloths pressed into service as wall hangings. There was food contributed by the assembled women of Pahrump, a fiddle player named Amos, who knew 7 songs and played each of them twice, and a quality of warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove and everything to do with people who had decided that this young woman and this quiet rancher deserved a proper send-off into their life together. Helena moved through the room with a composure that Kellen watched with specific attention. She thanked people genuinely, not performatively genuinely, the way she did everything looking at the person she was speaking to rather than past them. She laughed twice at things Ruth's husband Frank said, and managed to make Frank look pleased with himself without being dishonest about whether he'd actually been funny. She held the hand of old Mabel Hart, who was 73, and had ridden in from her homestead specifically for this, and listened to Mabel's story about her own arrival in Nevada 40 years ago, with her whole attention, not the polite half-attention of someone waiting to move on. This is who she is, Kellen thought watching. Not just with me. This is who she is. He was standing with Frank Caldwell, not really tracking the conversation, when Ruth appeared at his elbow and said without preamble, "You're watching her." "I'm allowed," he said. "She's my wife." The word still felt extraordinary in his mouth. He was keeping that private. "You're watching her like you're still surprised she's real," Ruth said. He thought about denying it. "Maybe," he said. "She watches you the same way," Ruth said, "in case you haven't noticed." She took a sip of her cider. "She watches you when you're not looking, with the same face you're making right now." She set the cup down. "I wanted you to know that." Kellen looked across the room to where Helena was talking to Mabel Hart, and as if the attention had weight, Helena glanced up at precisely that moment and found him across the crowded room and held the look for exactly 2 seconds before returning to Mabel. But in those 2 seconds, something passed between them that required no translation. "Thank you, Ruth," Kellen said. "Don't thank me. Go be with your wife." He went. So, the weeks that followed the wedding settled into a new shape. Same ranch, same work, same rhythms, But with something released between them, some last-held breath finally let out. She moved through the house with full ownership now, which she hadn't entirely done before. There had always been a slight tentativeness, a courtesy toward the space that was really his. That was gone. She rearranged the main room furniture on a Tuesday without asking, because she'd been thinking about the light and the traffic flow for 3 weeks, and she'd figured out a better arrangement. She told him after. He looked at it and said, "That's better." And that was the end of it. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. Not confessions, practical things, observations, the running commentary of a man who had been alone long enough that his interior life had accumulated without an outlet. She received these things with the same attention she gave everything, and occasionally said something back that reframed it, not to correct him, but to add dimension he hadn't seen. One evening in November, she said, "I want to expand the kitchen garden in spring." How much? Double, maybe more. She had a hand-drawn plan on a piece of paper she'd been working on for a week. He could tell by the wear at the edges. "If I can get the yield up, I can sell to Ruth. She pays fair. I've seen her books." "You've seen Ruth's books." "She showed me." I asked. She spread the paper on the table. "We're leaving money in the ground every season, Kellen. With proper irrigation from the east well and a cold storage arrangement, I've been thinking through we could produce enough to supply the dry goods through winter. Ruth's been ordering from Reno. The freight costs her badly." He looked at the plan. It was thorough. She'd accounted for the water, the soil, the seasonal temperature shifts, the labor time against the ranch's existing demands. She'd done this calculation before she brought it to him, which meant she'd already done the work of deciding it was viable. She was presenting it, not asking permission. "What do you need to start?" he said. She looked up. "That's all. Just what do I need?" "You've clearly already figured out that it works," he said. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't. What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment with that evaluating look that had once been pure wariness, and had become something else, something that trusted what it was evaluating. Then she looked at the paper and said, "Lumber for the cold storage frame, another 50 feet of fence. Seeds by February or we miss the window." "I'll get the lumber next supply run," he said. "Write down what seeds and where I should order from." She wrote the list that night, the pen moving fast and certain across the paper, and watching her, Kellen thought about her stepfather's word, unsuitable, and what a precise injustice it was that the person who'd used that word had been anywhere near this woman's life. The cold storage frame went up in December. Helena designed the joining herself, having figured out from Kellen's tools and materials what was available, and adapting the design accordingly. Kellen built it to her specifications, with only 2 deviations, both of which he cleared with her in advance, and she accepted both modifications without wounded pride because they were sound modifications, and she cared more about the structure working than about the design being unchanged. They were good together at the work. That was the thing Kellen kept arriving at over and over from different angles. They were specifically good at the work of building something because they had overlapping strengths and compatible gaps. She saw systems, he saw materials. She planned 3 moves ahead. He executed the present move with total attention. She caught the things his pragmatism overlooked. He caught the things her forward momentum didn't stop to account for. Ruth noticed it. She said on a January afternoon, when both of them were in the dry goods discussing spring supply orders, "You two argue like you've been married for 20 years. Helena looked up from the order sheet. "We were discussing," she said. "You were disagreeing about the cold storage drainage," Ruth said, "and neither of you was angry, and both of you were right about different parts of the same problem. That's arguing like you've been married for 20 years. She looked at Kellen. Most men would have shut the conversation down by now. "Most men haven't been paying attention to her for 4 months, Kellen said. Helena looked at him with precisely the face she'd made the first time he'd said something like that. The surprise. The something underneath the surprise. Except now the something underneath it had a name, and it wasn't complicated. "The drainage needs a secondary channel," she said back to the order sheet. But her pen was moving with slightly more force than necessary, which he had learned was what happened when she was feeling something she'd decided not to say out loud. He filed that information away. Later, when they were back at the ranch and the day was done, and they were at the table with the lamp between them, he said, "Helena." She looked up. "I pay attention to you," he said. "I want you to know that's not a courtesy. It's not what a good husband is supposed to do. It's—" He stopped, choosing the words with the same deliberateness she used. "It's that you're worth paying attention to, specifically, independently of any arrangement between us." She looked at him steadily. "You've said versions of that before," she said. "The first time you said something like that was on the wagon from the station. I thought you were being kind." She set her pen down. "I know now it's not kindness. It's accuracy." Something in her face was very open, the way it only got when the room was quiet, and the day was done, and they had stepped past the ordinary operations of living into something more essential. "I want you to know that I—" She stopped. "Say it," he said, the way he had once said it to her in this same kitchen. "I want you to know that you were worth coming to," she said. 2,000 miles of desert. I'd never seen a man I'd never met. You were worth every mile of it." She picked up the pen again. "I thought you should hear that." The lamp burned low between them. Kellen Parker, who had built a ranch alone and waited 24 years for someone to show up and see it, who had built a room before he knew who it was for and kept a promise through 6 weeks that cost him, and never once let it show. Kellen Parker sat with what she had just said and felt it settle into him the way only true things settle completely permanently without remainder. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "It's just the truth." Outside, the January wind came in across the flats and pressed against the walls of the house Kellen had built with his own hands, and the house held. It was built for exactly this. The spring came in hard that year, late frost that killed the first round of seedlings, then a warm week that came too fast and confused everything that had survived. Helena replanted without complaint on her knees in the kitchen garden 3 mornings in a row, resetting what the cold had taken. Kellen watched her work and offered once to help, and she said, "I've got it," in the tone that meant she genuinely had it and wasn't being proud about it, so he let her have it and went to fix the north fence instead. The second planting took. By May, the kitchen garden was twice the size it had been the previous year, exactly as she'd planned, and the first delivery to Ruth's Dry Goods happened on a Friday morning in June. Beans, early squash, dried herbs in labeled paper packets that Helena had spent an evening preparing with the same methodical attention she gave everything. Ruth weighed the delivery, calculated the payment, and handed over the money without inflating the amount, because Helena had said early in the arrangement that she wanted fair payment, not generous payment, that generosity carried obligation, and she preferred a clean transaction. Ruth had looked at her when she said that and said, "Clara Parker used to say almost exactly the same thing." Helena had pocketed the money and said, "Then we both learned it the right way." She brought the money home and put it in the tin box on the kitchen shelf. Not Kellen's household tin, a separate one, which he had noticed and never mentioned, because he understood without being told that it was important to her to have something that was specifically hers, not theirs, not the ranch's, not the arrangements. Hers. And the understanding of that, the instinct to leave it unquestioned, was something she noticed and stored alongside all the other things she had observed and counted. By August, the tin box had a satisfying weight to it. By the following spring, it had enough to purchase the second sewing machine she'd been calculating toward, a newer treadle model, better tension, faster feed, which she bought from a catalog and had shipped from Sacramento, and assembled herself on the kitchen table, reading the instructions once and then setting them aside. She had started sewing for other people by then. Not professionally, not yet, but Ruth had mentioned to someone that the woman out at the Parker Ranch could sew, and that someone had mentioned it to someone else, and within a season, Helena had 3 women in Pahrump who brought her mending and alteration work, and left with better results than they'd expected and told other people about it. She charged fairly, not cheaply. She had thought carefully about this and concluded that charging too little told people the work wasn't worth much, which wasn't true and shouldn't be communicated. Kellen came home one afternoon to find a woman he'd never met sitting at the kitchen table while Helena took her measurements. both of them talking about a dress pattern with the focused efficiency of a business transaction conducted between equals, and he made himself coffee and took it to the porch without interrupting. And when the woman had gone and Helena came out to find him, she said, "I have 11 orders." "I know," he said. "Ruth told me." She looked at him. "What else did Ruth tell you?" "That you're undercharging." Helena was quiet for a moment. "I'm building a clientele," she said. "The price goes up once the reputation is established." "That's what Ruth said you'd say when I told her." "Then Ruth understands the strategy." "Ruth said you've got more business sense than any woman she's known since—" He stopped. "Since Clara Parker." Helena finished. "Yeah." She sat down on the porch bench beside him and looked out at the flats in the late afternoon light. This was still her favorite hour, this particular light, the same light he'd described on the wagon ride from the station, and she'd asked to see and had never stopped watching for. "I like being compared to her," she said. "I don't take it lightly." "She'd have said you were exactly right about the pricing," Kellen said. "And then she'd have told you to charge more anyway." Helena laughed, and he thought with some regularity, now without drama, as a settled fact that the sound of her laughing in this specific place was the best sound the ranch had ever held. Their first child came in the second year of the marriage in October, when the desert was cooling and the light was going golden and long. The labor was hard and long, and Kellen sat outside the bedroom door for 11 hours and was not by any measure the calm, steady presence he prided himself on being. Ruth had come out and was inside with Helena along with the doctor from Pahrump, and at the 6-hour mark, Ruth opened the door and looked at Kellen sitting on the floor against the wall and said, "She's doing fine. She told me to tell you she's fine and to stop making that face." "I don't have a face," Kellen said. "You have had a face for 6 straight hours," Ruth said. "She also said to tell you that she's fully capable of doing this, which she is, and to please go make yourself useful somewhere." He went to the barn. He mucked 3 stalls that didn't need mucking, repaired a hinge that had been working fine, and reorganized the tack wall in a way that made no improvement over the previous organization. Chester watched him do all of this with the patient dignity of a horse who understood something was happening and was willing to bear witness. When Ruth came to the barn door and said, "Kellen, come in," he walked back to the house and into the bedroom, and Helena was sitting up against the headboard, tired in a way that was completely different from any tired he'd seen before. A deep kind, a spent kind. The tiredness of someone who has crossed a significant distance, and she was holding a bundle against her chest, and she looked up at him when he came through the door with an expression that was too large for her face to contain normally. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the bundle, and the bundle resolved into a person, small, red-faced, thoroughly indignant about existing, wrapped in the blanket Helena had been quilting for 4 months. "A girl," Helena said. "She has your jaw. She has my jaw already. She's stubborn, that's enough." He looked at this tiny, furious person his wife was holding and felt something break open in him. Not painfully, not with violence, the way something breaks open when it has been full for a long time and finally has enough space. He reached out and put one hand carefully against the blanket and didn't say anything for a long time. "Clara," Helena said. He looked up at her. "If that's all right," she said. "I've been thinking about it since March." He looked back at the baby. His throat was doing something complicated. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." The baby Clara Parker, named for a woman she'd never meet, and who had left a room and a sewing machine and a recipe for apple cake and a son worth knowing, opened her eyes briefly, regarded the world with profound skepticism, and went back to sleep. The second child, a boy, James, born 2 years later, came faster and easier, and Kellen was better prepared for it, which meant he only reorganized the tack wall once. James had Helena's eyes, the dark-edged green that missed nothing, and from approximately his 3rd year of life demonstrated a comprehensive interest in how everything worked and why, which Helena received with perfect patience. and Kellen received with a father's complicated mix of pride and exhaustion. Clara at 4 was already following Kellen through the barn with the focused observational energy of a child who has decided she's going to understand this place completely and is simply collecting data. She asked the same questions her mother asked, methodical, precise, genuinely interested in the answer, and Kellen answered them all the way. Helena had taught him to answer, which was completely and without condescension, because a child who asks real questions deserves real answers. The ranch grew. The kitchen garden had expanded a third time by then with a proper irrigation line Kellen and Helena had designed together over a winter, arguing productively about the drainage, as Ruth would say. And the supply relationship with Ruth's dry goods had formalized into a written agreement with set prices and seasonal schedules. Helena's sewing work had grown from 11 orders to a steady stream that required her to schedule 2 days a week specifically for it, and keep a written appointment book on the kitchen shelf beside the household tin, and the separate tin, which had been joined by a third tin, which Helena described only as for later when Kellen asked about it. He didn't ask again. It was Ruth, on a Saturday afternoon 3 years into the marriage, who first said the word that Helena had been carefully not using. "You need to consider a proper shop," Ruth said. They were in the dry goods, Helena delivering the fall produce order, James on her hip, Clara examining a bolt of calico with professional focus. "The work you're doing out of the house, you're turning people away. I see you turning them away." "I don't have the capacity to take more orders," Helena said. "I have a ranch to run and 2 children." "You have a husband who runs the ranch," Ruth said. "You do the books and the garden and the supply operation. And you sew. You're doing 4 jobs, Helena. A shop would let you consolidate 2 of them and do both better." Helena shifted James to her other hip and looked at Ruth with the expression she used when she was hearing an argument she'd already had with herself. "The capital investment is manageable, and you know it," Ruth said. "I've seen your tins." Helena looked at her sharply. "You've seen nothing. I know what 3 tins on a kitchen shelf means," Ruth said without any apology. "The first is the household, the second is yours, the third is for a plan you haven't told anyone yet. That's what it means." She met Helena's eyes directly. "Am I wrong?" The dry goods was very quiet for a moment. "No," Helena said. "You're not wrong." She told Kellen that evening after the children were down. She sat across from him at the table and said, "I want to talk about the shop." He looked up. "All right." She looked at him for a moment. "You knew." "I thought it was probably coming," he said. "The third tin's been heavy for a while." She laughed, startled, then let the laugh settle into something more serious. "I need to know what you think. Not your permission, I want to be clear about that." "I know. I want to know what you actually think." He considered it honestly, the way she'd always wanted him to consider things. "I think you've been running a business from this kitchen for 3 years, and you've been disciplined about it, and it works. I think a shop would mean you're in town part of the week, and I'd need to adjust the ranch schedule." He paused. "I think you'd be excellent at it. I think people in this valley need what you make, and I think you know that." He looked at her. "And I think you've been holding back because you weren't sure if it was too much to ask." She was very still. "It's not too much to ask," he said. "Nothing you've ever asked has been too much." She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, in the way they got when she was feeling something too large to hold in her chest comfortably. "You know," she said, "when I was on that train coming west, I made myself a list of what I needed. Not what I wanted, what I needed. The minimum conditions for a life that was livable." She paused. "You've exceeded every item on that list. Significantly." "What was on the list?" he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling the full, real smile. "Private," she said, "entirely. The last item was someone who means what he says." She met his eyes. "That one I'll give you." He held her gaze across the lamp-lit table. This table that had held so many conversations, so many decisions, so many silences that were full rather than empty. "The shop," he said. "What do you need to start?" 1. The Parker Sewing Shop opened in Pahrump in the spring of 1883 in a narrow storefront between the hardware and the post office that had been used for storage and smelled like old rope and dust until Helena spent 2 days cleaning it and one afternoon painting the sign herself in plain black letters on a white board. Ruth came to see it. On the day before it opened, walked through the small space, examined the placement of the machines, the cutting table, the fitting corner with the mirror she'd sourced from a freighter passing through. She said nothing for a long walk through, and then she stood at the door and said, "Your sign." Helena looked at it. "It says Parker Sewing," Ruth said, "not Helena Parker Sewing." "Parker is sufficient," Helena said. "Everyone knows which Parker." "They do now," Ruth said. "Put your name on it. The work is yours." Helena looked at the sign for a long moment. Then she went and got the brush and added in the same plain letters, H. Parker Proprietor. Ruth looked at it. "Better," she said. The shop ran 3 days a week for the first year, 2 full days the second year, and by the third year it was open 5 days and employing a local girl named Nora Briggs, Stu Briggs's niece, for the more routine alterations which freed Helena for the work that required her specific skill. The money from the shop went into a 4th tin, which she labeled in her precise handwriting on a strip of paper, "The Children." Kellen saw the label and said nothing. He went to the barn and stood with Chester for a while. Chester, who was old, now slower but still solid, still present, and thought about a woman who had arrived with 1 carpet bag and a mother's letter. She couldn't read for weeks, and had proceeded with total focus and complete integrity to build an entire world inside the world he'd made, not in spite of the arrangement, not despite the way it started. Because of what she had decided to make it. He went back inside and found her at the kitchen table with Clara on one side and James on the other, explaining to them both, with the same complete attention she gave everything, how the ledger system worked, and why keeping accurate records was the foundation of any enterprise. Clara was 7 and was absorbing it with her mother's ferocious focus. James was 5 and was more interested in drawing animals in the margin of the ledger page, but Helena was letting him because she knew he was listening, even when he looked like he wasn't. Kellen stood in the doorway and watched his family at the kitchen table under the lamp, and something settled in him that had been waiting to settle for a very long time. He walked to the table and sat down, and Clara immediately said, "Papa, Mama's explaining debits." And he said, "Show me." And Clara slid the ledger toward him with a proprietary air, and James added a horse to the margin, and Helena looked across the table at Kellen with the particular look that was only for him, steady and clear, and full of everything that didn't need to be said, because it had already been said every night for 5 years, in coffee cups set on the left side of the stove, and fence lines checked for rabbits from the east, and a plain gold ring, sized with a piece of thread. Decades passed. The way decades pass when you are building something real. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of time that is fully used. Clara Parker grew into a woman with her mother's precision and her father's steadiness, and she took over the shop at 22 and made it larger than Helena had, adding 2 more machines and a ready-made line that sold to the new families arriving in the valley in steady numbers as the railroad expanded. She had her grandmother's name, and Ruth said with satisfaction in her last years, her grandmother's stubbornness. James Parker became a man who understood how things worked and why, and he brought that understanding to the north section of the ranch that Kellen signed over to him on his 25th birthday, and he worked it with his father's hands and his mother's systems, and produced results that made the original 600 acres look modest. The valley grew around the Parker Ranch, the way valleys grow, not all at once, but incrementally, one family at a time, one building at a time. Until the spare desert Kellen had built a house in alone was a place with a school and a bank and a church with a proper roof and a dry goods run by Frank Caldwell's son after Frank and Ruth were gone. Ruth went first, which surprised no one, because Frank had always been the quiet one, and quiet ones often wait for the loud ones to be done first, before they let themselves follow. Helena sat with Ruth in her last weeks, and they talked about the things women talk about when time is running short. The real things, the things that matter, the inventory of a life. Ruth said in one of those final conversations. I came to your ranch that first time because I decided you needed a friend. I want you to know that I was the one who benefited. Helena held her hand and said, We both did. Clara would have liked you, Ruth said. I know I've said that before. You've said it 12 times, Helena said. I've counted. Ruth laughed, and it was the last real laugh Helena heard from her, and she held it carefully afterward. Kellen and Helena grew old together, the way people grow old, when they have built something together with the deep familiarity of two people who have been through the cold years and the growing years, and the years of loss, and the years of abundance, and who have kept their word to each other through all of it. Through the ordinary frictions and the real sorrows and the accumulated weight of decades lived honestly, they slowed. That was the plainest truth of age. The pace changed, and the things you used to do without thinking required thought, and the body made its negotiations with time, and you accepted the terms because the alternative was not on offer. But the kitchen table was still the kitchen table, and the morning coffee was still made and left on the left side of the stove, and the light still came in across the flats at dawn, in that particular way that had no exact name. On an October morning, 41 years after a train pulled into the Pahrump station, and a young woman stepped off it, gripping a carpet bag with both hands. Kellen Parker sat on the covered porch with his wife of 4 decades and watched his grandchildren run through the yard. 3 of them, Clara's oldest and James's 2 youngest, loud and impractical and utterly certain of their welcome in this place. Helena sat beside him with her coffee white-haired, now smaller than she had been, but no less precise, no less present. She watched the children with the look she had given the dawn light all those years ago, full and quiet and entirely here. You're thinking something, Kellen said. I'm always thinking something. Something specific. She was quiet for a moment, watching the children. Then she said, I'm thinking about the train, about that platform. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were the same dark-edged green unchanged in 40 years. I was so frightened. I didn't show it. I'd decided not to show it, but I was. A pause. And then I saw you standing still in the crowd, the only person not moving, and you looked... She considered. You looked like someone who had been waiting long enough that the waiting had become part of him. He looked at her. And that was reassuring. It was honest, she said. And honest was what I needed. She looked back at the children. You were the most honest thing I'd seen in 2 years. He sat with that for a while. The children shouted something at each other across the yard, a dispute about rules quickly negotiated and resolved. Helena, he said. Kellen, I told you I'd wait however long it took for your heart. He said it simply, looking at their grandchildren running in the morning light. And you gave it to me anyway, faster than I deserved. She turned and looked at him with those steady green eyes, and he saw in them, as he had seen for 41 years, the woman who had stepped off that train and decided, not been pushed, not been cornered, not been complied into it, but decided freely and completely to make a life here with him, from nothing but honesty and patience, and the willingness to build. You deserved every day of it, she said. Don't let me hear you say otherwise. He smiled the particular smile she had been the only one to fully earn. Yes, ma'am, he said. She reached over and covered his hand with hers, the gold ring still on her finger, worn smooth by 41 years of work and living. And they sat together in the morning light while their grandchildren ran through the yard of the ranch that Patience had built, and the day came in clear and whole and entirely enough.